Hey there, welcome back to Talking Through Truth. I'm your host, Taylor, and I welcome you to the really more of the first deep dive episode we're going to go into. I know the first one, we looked at the reason for studying scripture and why I'm starting this podcast, but now we're going to start talking about different issues. And I think the first one that, at least from the Bible's perspective, we should talk about is world origins. Now, before you before you hop off, you're kind of thinking, why are we talking about this? Why is this important? Well, as I'll re-mention at the end, your understanding of how the world was created really opens a door for you to be a gospel witness. So, if you will, I'm looking in Genesis 1 if you'd like to open there. Before we get even into that, though, I want to first look at and understand what are some different interpretations or different understandings of how this universe came to be the way that it is. Now, I just wanted a really quick oversight of, well, how did these things even what are these ideas? Well, giving a really quick Google search gave me a very nice summary of a few different ones that I find really interesting. Looking at the first one, we look at what does Greek mythology say? It says that the world emerged from primordial chaos, with deities like Gaia or Earth and Uranus or Sky playing key roles. So off the bat, the very first one we're looking at is okay, there's some kind of deity that made the world, or in the Greek's case, deities plural. Then looking at what does Norse mythology have to say, it says that the world began with a collision of fire and ice, creating the primeval being Ymir, from whose body the world is formed. Yet again, it's a creation, but this time instead of there being deities who create this big world, you get almost these two elements, fire and ice. They come together and they form the deity, the god Ymir, who then creates, or whose body is the world. Then Hinduism teaches that the universe is believed to be created, preserved, and destroyed in cycles by Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, respectively. Now, this was kind of interesting. Again, this is a subject for another day, but world religions here, with Hinduism talking about reincarnation, not only are humans and animals reincarnated, looks like the universe itself is in a process of reincarnation to where it's born, then it's preserved for X amount of time, and then it's destroyed, but then it's born again. So that's also in a kind of reincarnation of its own. Then going to our next one, Buddhism teaches that the universe is seen as one of many in an infinite series with no specific claim for a single origin. So this almost gives you the multiverse idea where it says that the universe it's seen as one out of many in an infinite series. So it just sounds like it's a thing that's always been. This universe is just one out of an infinite number. Then we get to the Chinese creation myth, which says the world and humans originated spontaneously from refined vital energy, undergoing transformation into yin and yang. This kind of interested me. When you look at yin and yang, they are basically two sides of the world, but they complement one another. When I looked at it, I know one gave the part of yin and part of yang. They were male and female opposites, and I can't remember which is which. But still, it's incorporated into one and female in the other, and that's how the world is with yin and yang as well. They're technically, if you will, they're opposites, but they're complementary. This gives me this is another subject for another day, but Gnosticism gives the idea that the spiritual world is good and the material is evil. Now, it's not the same as yin and yang necessarily, but it gives me that same idea of, okay, there's two major splits on the Chinese side of things. They're complementary. Yin and yang, they're complements of one another that make up the world. But Gnosticism teaching that, well, anything material is evil, anything spiritual is good. Then we get to another one here, which is this labels it as an indigenous American culture. It teaches that the universe is seen as alive and having feelings of gratitude and indebtedness to it. So that we as people, maybe the animals, we owe the universe, we're indebted. It gives me the exact same feeling as maybe something like Mother Nature. I know maybe we'll use it just as a term, but still it gives that idea of we're now personifying nature. No longer is it a thing, it's an actual person, it's a being, it's a deity. And we as part of that universe, or as the very creatures created by that universe, we owe gratitude to it. I thought that was kind of interesting. Before we get into the big part, one last one that list doesn't mention is evolution. Of course, maybe you were taught this in school or heard it from a friend or someone on TV or something like that. But we know that evolution teaches there was this thing labeled as the Big Bang, which ultimately created everything. That there was nothing, and then all of a sudden this big boom happened, and then your universe and everything in it is created. And of course, within that, it takes millions upon billions and billions of years for stuff to evolve and to gradually grow into whatever, whether it be animals, the cells, the, if you want to call it elements, all these different things. It took years and years and years for all that to happen. Now, these are a bunch of different views on, you want to call it origins, because not all of these origins claim a creation. And that's what it all boils down to is, yes, are there many different ideas? And even when you start getting into philosophies, maybe about life, where people will say, oh, well, this world and everything in it is something like a dream or a figment of your own imagination. You can get those more wacko ideas. But what's interesting is looking at all these others, it really boils down to one of two things. One, the universe has always been. It's its own infinite sort of thing. It's maybe itself a deity. It's just always been around. But the second view, the second part of this would be, well, if the universe isn't infinite, if it's not an eternal thing, element, being, whatever, well, it was made by something or somebody. It itself is a creation. And it was created by an outside force, whether it's an explosion, some kind of deity, it was created in some way. Now we got all these different answers. Now we're thinking, okay, what does scripture have to say about all of that? Well, for those who are Christians, we understand what the scripture says, but it's always good to look and to build that biblical answer. So, again, if you're still there, Genesis 1:1, what does it say here? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. It goes on to say, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. Now, those first three verses, Scripture claims that first off, There is a God, there's a deity, something existed before the world. What do those first four words say? In the beginning, God. But then what's that verb attached to the word God there? It says God created. So not only does scripture affirm there's a deity, that this deity also created. He created the world, the heaven and the earth. He created the entire universe. But even then, even when you look at scripture, and it's easy to say, okay, according to scripture, there was a creation. Well, there are many different views. And there are a few I remember learning from school that I have typed out here. The first one we talked about is that called the gap theory, where scholars, when they those who believe this, state that there was a gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, in which the world was created and destroyed, and a second world was created. When I searched this up, I read this that the idea is also that in Genesis 1:1, you're looking at God's original perfect creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That was perfect. When you get to Genesis 1:2, the scholars will say that that verse describes a state of ruin or chaos that occurred after a cataclysmic event, likely to Satan's rebellion. God then recreated the earth in the 6 days described in the rest of Genesis. And the idea there being, all right, you have the original perfect creation, but then after that, likely due to Satan's rebellion, the world fell into turmoil and chaos. And that time, before Genesis 1:2 is undefined, could have been a short time, maybe some would say a long time. But then, after all of that, you get to Genesis 1:2, where there's this mess, just this wreck and ruin, and then God recreates another world. He does it all over again. That's what we get from verses 3 through 31. And that again, that's the gap theory. Now there's another one, a day age theory. And this I got from the Blue Letter Bible, a great resource tool that says each day, the word day here, says that each day in Genesis 1 actually refers to an era or age lasting a great length of time. So when, for example, Genesis 1:4 talks about that God made this light, he saw it was good, and then Genesis 1:5 he calls the light day, the darkness night. Then it says the evening and the morning were the first day. Now looking at that, these day age theorists would say, oh, that word day isn't really a day as we would think of it. The word day means a long span of time. Who knows how many years, but it's a long time. And then there's the framework hypothesis, which also from the Blue Letter Bible talks about how the days of creation are merely literary devices used by Moses to demonstrate theological truths of covenant promises and the role of the Sabbath. Now, historians come down to the fact that Moses wrote the Torah, right? Genesis through Deuteronomy. And when God gives him these, he tells Moses the history and he gives him these things to write down. When Moses looks at these things, he puts them in the form of days in order to give an illustration. Maybe he would think, oh, well, the Israelites could not understand this unless I have to shape it and put it in a way that they would understand it. So, not not being a real day, but this is a framework. It's Let me put it to you in a way that would make sense to you. Let's call this a day and that these certain days represent different theological ideas or promises. That's the framework hypothesis. Again, it's not literal. These days, they're not actual days. Then you get to theistic evolution, which is a combining, of course, of evolution and creation, where the idea is that God used evolution to create the world. So there, in that light, evolution did occur, but God used evolution. Again, though, throughout all of these, you're running into the issue of the word day. Is it literal? Is it figurative? What's the deal with it? Well, there's that fifth view of creation, a literal 24-hour creationism, which says that God created the world and everything in it in 6 literal 24-hour days. Now, the way that we think of a day, 24 hours, of course, that's the kind of day that this view claims God created the world. In 6 days, of course, as the reading talks about day 1, the light and the darkness, day 2, the sky and the seas, day 3, the land, the plants, day 4, the sun, moon, and stars, day 5, the birds and the fish, day 6, land, animals, and man. Looking at those different views of creationism, which one's right? Well, before we even get into that, let's first understand that Scripture is clear on the fact that God created the world. Again, Scripture begins with the assumption there is a God, there is a deity, something, somebody who created the universe. Now, looking at that, there's arguments for each of these, yes, but what makes the most sense, and I got some good solid background, if you want to call it that, from godquestions.org. Again, it's a website, but it gives a good brief summary of how to explain why would Genesis support a 24-hour day in Genesis 1 through 31. The main idea being that the Hebrew word for day being yom, it could mean, yes, a literal 24-hour day, but it could also mean a long time or an age. But one thing that if I've learned anything from Bible school, is that context is key when you're studying. And based on the context of the word yom here, it just makes the most sense that this is used as a 24-hour day. That Genesis doesn't suggest ages or periods or eons, suggests days, literal 24-hour days. And in 6 of those, God created the world. Now, looking at that, the question can come up, why on earth are we talking about this? Why is it so important to look at Genesis and to understand the creation of the world? And this didn't hit me too hardly until learning in college a little bit, and that's when the point struck out. I wrote it down here that one of the main issues that we'll talk about later in another video is the issue of sin. Now, when you look at Genesis, maybe you look at it from a scientific perspective, or let's shore up our beliefs in this. Well, this is something that maybe you can attach to that, because when you think of creation, your view and your understanding of creation is going to affect your outlook on a lot of other things, but especially this issue of sin. Let me ask you this question. If the world has always existed in the exact way it is, it's always been this way and it always will be, well, thinking about it, when did sin enter the world? Now, the Bible has an answer on that again, we'll get into later. But when did sin enter into the world? If it's always been, maybe even if it's been millions and billions of years, when did sin creep in? And the idea, the thinking of that is, well, if sin, there was no entrance of sin into the world, that means sin has always been a part of it. Evil, wickedness, all the horrible things, that's always been a part of the world when you look at it like that. And even from an evolutionary perspective, you have to wonder when in that evolutionary line or the trail there, when did that sin, when did all those things come in? Now you could say, oh, it's a natural greed, natural pride kind of thing, but that just goes back to the question of, okay, well, where did that greed and pride come from? Was it just embedded into some evolutionary process? And if so, where did that come from? And that's kind of the question you have. But a more serious question from there would be, if sin is merely a part of the world, it is what it is, it's nothing that needs to be fixed, it's all natural, then why on earth did Jesus come and die for us, right? Was there a need for God in heaven to come down and die if there is no sin problem? Think about that, right? Paul talks about how if Christ didn't rise again, then our faith is in vain, yes. But also, do you understand the issue that sin is a problem? It's not a natural process. It's not just something that has always been. As the Bible will state, that sin began when Adam disobeyed God. And that was a problem that needed to be fixed. And out of God's love for humanity, he would later send his son, God in the flesh, Jesus, to die for that sin, the sin of humankind, and forgive us of our sin. That's the importance of it. Sin didn't just happen. It's not some little minor issue. No, no, when you look at the creation of the world, you also have to understand it's not all physical. There are some spiritual issues, and one of them being sin. Where did that start? And think about that, because having this general understanding of sin, the creation of the world, it all ties together. Because somebody may come up to you in a class, at college, or in your school, maybe a coworker, and they might have questions. This issue might come up, and you have to be ready to answer that. Maybe somebody's taught in school that evolution is that's the only way this world could have existed, but then you have a biblical answer that says no. The world was not just merely put together by some accident. It was divinely organized, divinely created. And then this is just one of those things too, that you can kind of open that door there for the gospel, because sin is the issue. And when you wondered how on earth there could be a world like this that's so wicked, well, it's because sin came in. It hasn't always been a part of it. Genesis 1 talks about how God created everything perfect. And then in Genesis 3, we see how the fall came about and how mankind sinned. This is just something I've had to think about that I wanted to share with those of you listening today. Understanding that, yes, creationism maybe is more of a sciencey thing, but also I think it's very important for us to get an understanding of this, again, to have that answer of our hope ready. Always giving this biblical answer, having it ready for whenever somebody may ask you, why are you so hopeful in this kind of world? Just want to share that with you guys today. Thank you again for listening. I hope this has been a blessing and a help to each and every one of you. I know this study has been for me, and I will continue to grow in my understanding and knowledge of these things and in many other things as well, with other video ideas and such. And if you happen to have any, please let me know and I will gladly look into those things. Thank you again for listening. God bless and ciao for now.